Okay, moving on to part 2, the human circulatory system. We did an overview, we introduced some of the vocabulary words and the players. Now let's look at the sort of details and follow the path of blood through the circulatory system. So this picture is a lot, and we'll work through, there's 10 different sort of bullet points that we're going to work through on this. I do encourage you to go through your textbook and spend some time with this picture. It walks you through each of the steps I'm going to talk about. And it's not necessarily that it's that tricky, but if you spend some time with it, it'll all kind of make more sense. If you just look at it and you're like, this is too much information, you freak out, you'll shut down, you will never understand it. So do take some time, both rewatch this lecture, then also go through your textbook and walk through each part step by step. Okay, starting here with part 1. The right atrium has 2 large veins that empty oxygen-poor blood, right, blue, from the upper and lower body. Again, we called that the superior vena cava, brings our oxygen-poor blood from our upper body, and our inferior vena cava bringing oxygen-poor blood from our lower body. Then we have part 2, the right ventricle pumps the oxygen-poor blood into the heart via the 2 pulmonary arteries, and they go left and right to each of our lungs. At our lungs, part 4 here, blood flows through the capillaries in your lungs where CO2 goes out into your lungs and oxygen comes into your blood. Then part 5 here, the newly oxygen-rich blood returns to your heart through pulmonary veins on both sides of your body. And then 6, it goes to the left atrium, which is the end of then our pulmonary circuit, out from the heart to the lungs, returning to the heart. That is the pulmonary circuit. Part 7, the blood pumped from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And then part 8, oxygen-rich blood leaves the left ventricle through the aorta, which again is the largest blood vessel in the body. Part 9, the aorta branches into coronary arteries that supply the heart and several large arteries that leaf into upper and lower body, like that. And within each organ, we have arteries that sort of branch into arterioles, which branch into capillaries that penetrate the tissues and allow gas exchange. After that, after we've deposited that oxygen or taken in that CO2 back into the blood, capillaries join into venules, which send blood back into veins. Step 10, oxygen-poor blood from the upper body is returned to the superior vena cava. And again, at the lower body, it's returned to the inferior vena cava. And both of those return blood to the heart back here, completing the systemic circuit. Again, I know that's a lot. That's a lot of steps. If you spend some time with it, it will start to make sense. So let's talk about how the heart works. The heart is the hub of the human cardiovascular system, and it's a muscular organ. It's about the size of your fists. The bigger your fists, the bigger your heart, generally speaking. So atrium, or atria, plural, collect blood returning to the heart and pump it to the ventricles. And the ventricles pump blood out to other organs, and these are much more powerful than the atria. So the right atrium receives blood from the body that's been deoxygenated, right? So here's from the lower body, from the upper body into the right atrium. And then the right ventricle pumps it to the lungs, right? We just talked about this. It flows back into the left atrium, which receives the blood from the lungs, and then the left ventricle pumps it to the rest of the body. And one sort of mnemonic to help you remember this is we say, come right in so you're not left out, meaning that blood comes into the body, into the, the heart from the body on the right-hand side, and then leaves the heart and goes to the body on the left. So come right in, comes in the right-hand side so you're not left out. It leaves on the left-hand side. Oh, I forgot this is a video. I thought this was a GIF. So I will try to find this video again and post it below the links for this particular lecture. And this just, it's an animation that shows this process, and it shows the pumping from one to the other. And I think it's kind of just cool to see. So I will post this below. Oh, there it goes. So you can see coming in the right atrium, release to the ventricle, pumping through the right ventricle, coming back into the left atrium, flowing into the left ventricle, and then pumping through the rest of the body. So I guess it did work. So I will not post the link below. Okay. So your blood vessels are a system of arteries, veins, and capillaries that transport blood and therefore gases and nutrients, etc., throughout your body. Again, I made this analogy that's sort of like your internal plumbing. So recall that arteries transport blood away from the heart, and veins transport blood back to the heart. And capillaries are small and allow for the exchange of gases and nutrients, etc., waste between the bloodstream and the interstitial fluid surrounding your tissues. And it turns out you have so many capillaries reaching their little fingers out throughout your body that every cell in your body is within 0.1 centimeters of a capillary. So there's not, if it needs to receive oxygen via diffusion to power your mitochondria, it doesn't have that far to diffuse from blood to each individual cell in your body. That is just amazing to me. All blood vessels are lined with tightly packed endothelial cells, epithelial cells. That epithelial cells are sort of the generic term for cells that form the various inner and outer surfaces of your body. So your skin has epithelial cells, your blood vessels have epithelial cells, your organs like your intestines, I think we talked about epithelial cells in digestion and in nutrient absorption in the last lecture. Okay, so they're all lined by epithelial cells, and the capillaries that are again the smallest part of your plumbing, that have the highest surface area, have these really thin walls, usually about 1 cell thick. And you see that here is the basement membrane. Don't worry about this word, just know that they have these thin walls that are about 1 cell thick. And the thin wall allows for the rapid exchange of nutrients, gases, etc., to and from tissues. And some capillaries are so narrow, they actually force blood cells to pass through the capillary single file. Right, so there's like 1 cell wide as well, which is pretty interesting to me. Veins and the smaller venules, right? Veins branch into venules and arteries branch into arterioles, are significantly larger and have 2 additional thick layers. So we're talking about capillaries. They have the epithelial, and they have the 1 cell thick sort of wall. The arteries and veins have 2 additional layers. They have the epithelia, and then they have the basement membrane or wall, just like the capillaries, and then an outer coat of elastic connective tissue that allows blood vessels to stretch and recoil. So think about it for pumping stuff, right? And you might be aware you do have a pulse, right? And we'll talk about pulse on the next slide, but you need to be able to sort of expand and contract the veins and arteries as your blood pumps. And that's what allows for the expanding and contracting of your veins and arteries. So the smooth muscle that constricts and relaxes regulates blood flow in response to signals from the brain. So you may have heard that, oh, after you eat, the blood rushes to your stomach to help you digest your food, and that's kind of true. And in this way, this is how you regulate the direction or the amount of blood flow, is through smooth muscles in the outer layers of your veins and arteries. Okay, so let's talk about flow through the arteries themselves. Your blood pressure, you may have taken every time you go to the doctor, they're going to take your blood pressure, right? The blood pressure is the force your blood exerts against the walls of your blood vessels as it's pumped by the heart. It pushes blood through the heart to the arteries, right, away from the heart, then to the arterioles and into capillaries. When your ventricles contract, blood is forced into the arteries faster than it can flow into the arterioles, and this causes them to stretch, right? So this is causing them to expand a little bit under pressure, and then when the blood has passed, they can relax, and this gives you sort of blood pressure. And you can see that here. Here's the pumping, and it gives you the sort of rhythmic flow of blood, which helps blood to flow in a particular direction. It squeezes here and pushes this way, squeezes here and pushes this way as the heart sort of pumps. When the ventricles of the heart relax, like I said, the walls of the arteries snap back, and that's your pulse. So your pulse maintains sufficient pressure for constant flow to capillaries and beyond. You don't want the lack of pressure to mean there's no blood flow at all, right? So however, as you might expect, the further you get from the heart, for example, the capillaries near your toes versus the ones up on your, I don't know, towards your stomach, the further you get from the heart, the lower your blood pressure is. And of course, it's going to be lower in capillaries than in veins or venules, etc. So that's flow through arteries. Now flow through capillaries, once it gets to arteries or veins and then flows into the arterioles or the venules, it gets to the capillaries. Again, this is the high surface area part for gas exchange, etc. You have muscles and sphincters that control blood flow through capillary beds in tissue. So they're capillary beds because it's just this large network. With the exception of vital organs, meaning your brain, your heart, and your kidneys, only about 5 to 10% of the capillary beds in your body have a steady flow of blood at any given time. They just don't need it all the time. They get it as needed. So as it says on the slide, blood is diverted as needed. So as I said before, it's diverted to your digestive tract after you've eaten, or it's diverted to your skeletal muscles. Those are the muscles that help you move your body. You divert blood to your skeletal muscles and your skin during intense exercise. Some of us, I know if I go and run a mile, my face flushes, right? That's part of it because they're diverting blood to your surface of your skin to help cool you down, right? So it's the same idea here. So as we've mentioned, the walls of capillaries are thin, right? They're about 1 cell thick, and it turns out they're actually pretty leaky. So your blood pressure helps push oxygen and nutrient-rich blood out into the interstitial fluid, which can then diffuse into nearby tissue cells, which is again how it's delivering oxygen, etc. At the venous end, over on this side, the deoxygenated blood, carbon dioxide and other waste products diffuse out of cells into the interstitial fluid and then into the capillaries, where then they can flow back through the to the lungs to be sort of exhaled. This type of local chemical exchange between the body's cells and the blood in the capillaries is the single most important function of the circulatory system. Again, throwback. Why do we breathe? Why do we have a circulatory system pumping blood throughout our body, etc., etc.? It's because it provides oxygen and food for cellular respiration, right, in our mitochondria to make the ATP that powers our entire bodies. It powers, again, the movement of my finger, the movement of my toes. It powers the pumping of my heart, right? If any of those things sort of stop, I will die. If I run out of ATP, I will die. So I need to constantly breathe, deliver oxygen to all of my mitochondria, make billions and trillions and probably more molecules of ATP to fuel all kinds of different cellular processes throughout my body. And then of course, at the same time, my mitochondria are releasing carbon dioxide, the waste product of cellular respiration that needs to flow back into my lungs where I can exhale it. Okay, then after it's this gas exchange has occurred in capillary beds, your blood's going to return via veins. So it goes from capillaries, blood then travels into the smaller venules, and then they kind of coalesce into veins, and then those coalesce into either the superior or inferior vena cava, again, depending on whether it comes from the upper or lower body. And then they flow back into the right atrium of the heart, where they can be passed to the left ventricle, pumped to the lungs, etc. After the capillaries, the blood pressure originating from the pumping of the left side of your heart is nearly 0. So despite this fact, like, why doesn't the blood just pool at your feet, right? How does your blood get back up against gravity towards your heart? So blood still moves through the blood vessels due to contractions of surrounding skeletal muscles. So your heart isn't the only thing really pumping blood. It gets it going, it gets it to your upper body and to your lower body, but to get it back to your heart, we have your skeletal muscles. So again, skeletal muscles are the ones that help you voluntarily move your body. Luckily, we don't have to think about our heart pumping, right? That's skeletal, that's cardiac muscle. That happens without us thinking about it, right? But skeletal muscle is the one where I think, oh, I'm going to move my finger, right? That's skeletal muscle. You have to think about moving that, right? So skeletal muscle contracts and allows for the flow of blood back to the heart. So here is an example of veins in your calves. that prevent backflow as they work against gravity. And this is the image looking at the calf muscles on the back of your leg. And it's the contraction of the skeletal muscles on either side of this vein, combined with the opening and closing of valves that prevent blood from going back down towards in the direction of gravity, that help to move oxygen depleted blood back towards your heart. And so that's another way we kind of looked at the details here. This is probably the single scariest, most intimidating image from this entire lecture here. But we've worked through the directions again. We walked through the 10 different steps on one single slide, and now we've kind of gone through each of them on successive slides in a little more detail. Now I want to talk about this. This is the simplified version. So let's talk about the simplified version before we continue on. And I would say when you go to study this for this particular exam, I would maybe start with this image, which again is from your textbook. Once you have this picture figured out, then go on to that more complex 10-step. It's all the same information, but this one's just a little less intimidating, I think. So let's talk about it again. All right, the right atrium has two veins that empty oxygen poor blood from the upper and lower body. Again, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. The right ventricle, so it flows from the right atrium into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the oxygen poor blood to the lungs via the two pulmonary arteries. That is, it goes to the left or it goes to the right lung. At the lungs, the blood flows through the capillaries, where carbon dioxide goes out to the lungs, oxygen comes from the lungs into the blood, and then that newly rich oxygen blood flows through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, which is the end again of the pulmonary circuit. Here's our pulmonary circuit from heart to lung to heart. From the left atrium, it flows to the left ventricle. The left ventricle then pumps it through the aorta to the rest of the body. And the branching from the aorta are the coronary arteries that supply the heart and several large arteries to the upper and lower body. And again, within each organ, we have arteries branching to arterioles, from arterioles to capillaries. Capillaries allow for exchange of gases and nutrients, etc. Then capillaries coalesce back into venules, which coalesce back into veins, which coalesce back into inferior and superior vena cava, and we've completed then sort of the systemic circuit of the circulatory system. So that's the path of blood. That's all the gory details. That's all you need to know from this. If you go on to take physiology, I'm sure you'll learn a lot more about this. Again, I'm not a physiologist. This is about the level of detail that I'm aware of the biology of the circulatory system. But I do think it's really cool, and I think I like to connect it back, like I said, all the way back to lecture 1. We're talking about why do we breathe. All of this is just to supply oxygen for our mitochondria. So that's what blood does, but let's talk a little bit more about the details of what blood is. What's it made of? So an adult human has around 11 pints of blood, and about half of the volume of your blood is plasma. 50% of your blood is plasma, which is itself 90% water and 10% dissolved substances like salts and proteins and other things that are being transported by your blood. That is nutrients, waste, hormones, etc., that direct cellular activity. The remainder of your blood volume, other than plasma, is made up of 3 different cell types. You can see those here. So here's plasma, it's about half of it. And then we have the 2 different, there's white blood cells and platelets make up about 1%, and red blood cells make up about 45%. And here's a picture under a microscope looking at sort of blood, and you can see the different blood cell types. There's red blood cells, again, those are the ones that carry oxygen, they contain hemoglobin, etc. There are white blood cells, talk about those in a minute, and then you also have the 3rd type is platelets. So let's talk about each of these types of cells. So red blood cells are the single most abundant cell type in your blood, and as we've said many times, they function to transport oxygen throughout your body. At any given time, you have about 25 trillion red blood cells in your bloodstream. And recall that it's the different types of carbohydrates on the surface of your red blood cells that determine your ABO blood group, right? You're either AB or A or B or O, right? That's due to carbohydrates on the surface of your sort of disc-shaped red blood cells. So there's 25 trillion of these, and each one of these cells contains around 250 molecules of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is the protein that binds and transports oxygen throughout your body. And it turns out oxygen doesn't readily dissolve in your blood. It needs hemoglobin to facilitate its transport. We talked about it before, way back when in the protein lectures, but hemoglobin has 4 polypeptide chains, and each of them contains what's called a heme group, and within the heme group is a single iron atom. You can see that here shown in sort of gray, and one iron atom can carry or bind 1 oxygen molecule. So if you do some quick math here, for each red blood cell, each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen, so 1 red blood cell can carry 1 billion molecules of oxygen. That's a lot. So, these are very small cells, which is good because that means they have the high surface area to volume ratio. And we said this before, but they have this sort of characteristic disc shape. And both of these, both the shape and the high surface area to volume ratio, just increases the surface area, which makes them better for oxygen absorption. Interestingly, red blood cells actually lack organelles, including a nucleus, but that's a good thing because it just means there's more room for hemoglobin. So remember we talked a little bit about plant cells, and some plant cells are either dead at maturity or also lack nuclei. So red blood cells are one of the sort of rare exceptions in sort of the animal world where they don't have nuclei, even though they are technically living cells. So a person who is anemic or who has anemia is often tired or worn out feeling, and this is because their cells aren't getting enough oxygen due to low levels of hemoglobin or low red blood cell count. And of course, you don't have hemoglobin, you don't have lots of red blood cells, you're not getting a lot of oxygen, you're not making a lot of ATP. So you literally have low chemical energy. All right, that's red blood cells. Let's talk about white blood cells. White blood cells are less abundant than red blood cells. You have about 700 times more red blood cells than white blood cells in your blood. These function primarily in your immune response, where they directly fight infections. I think we looked at a video way back when talking about phagocytosis in the cell lectures, where we watched a white blood cell kind of crawl along and chase after a bacterium. So that's an example of how they function in your immune response. They are larger than red blood cells, and they're almost amoeba-like in their movement, and we'll come back to that in a second. They lack hemoglobin. They're not red, and they don't function in oxygen transport, but they have all their organelles are intact because in this case, the organelles are important for their function. Their function isn't transport, it's sort of hunting down infectious material. So because they are part of your body's immune response, their numbers increase significantly when your immune system is fighting an infection. Now let's see if this will work. I did make a GIF. So this is a GIF of that picture. Here's the video I mentioned previously. So here's a white blood cell crawling around. These are red blood cells, and these little red black dots here are bacteria. This is a white blood cell crawling through blood, probably on a petri dish, hunting down that bacterium. Let's see if it goes again. There it goes. So it's crawling around, it's sort of amoeba-like, going after that bacterium, and eventually it will phagocytose it and sort of neutralize the threat, if you will. And then here's another example this is white blood cells. All these little dots here are white blood cells, and here's a parasitic worm. And they are going to town, doing their job, trying to take out this threat, right? So let's see them sort of swarming all over this infectious nematode. All right, the third type of blood cells are platelets, and they are normally found in your blood. They are involved directly in blood clotting, and platelets aren't exactly cells in the right sense. They're simply bits of membrane-bound cytoplasm that pinch off from larger cells in your bone marrow. And the clotting begins when tissues lining a blood vessel are damaged. For example, when you start bleeding, right? Those blood vessels are damaged, blood is leaking out of your circulatory system, and clotting begins. And so what happens is that platelets adhere to damaged tissue and form clusters that seal these sort of minor breaks. And this is what you're looking at here. This is sort of a cluster of these platelets trying to kind of clog that leak, if you will. In addition, platelets release these factors, these molecular signals that trigger the conversion of a protein called fibrinogen to fibrin. And fibrinogen is a protein that's found in your plasma of your blood, and it turns it into fibrin, which is a thread or fiber-like protein, which is good for sort of grabbing and connecting the platelets to one another to form a scab. Hemophilia, we've talked about before in terms of, we talked about the genetics of it. Hemophilia is a genetic disease that we've mentioned that occurs when there's insufficient blood clotting. And then that means that patients with hemophilia can die of excessive blood loss due to even the smallest cuts. On the flip side, too much clotting can be a bad thing too, because a blood clot that occurs in the wrong place, if you have overactive platelets, for example, can dislodge, travel through your blood, and if it blocks an artery to the heart, that leads to a heart attack. Or if it blocks an artery that's leading to your head, that can lead to a stroke, right? So it's kind of this fine balance of not too much clotting, but not insufficient clotting, and you got to have the right sort of ratio of these different types of cells in your blood in order to have your blood function properly.